mission qui a tenu à réitérer l'importance qu'a eu Olympiques spéciaux dans son cheminement. Malheureusement, nous avons appris que le financement fédéral supplémentaire à l'organisme arrivait à l'échéance et qu'il ne serait pas renouvelé. Or, pour pouvoir continuer sa mission essentielle et réussir à se reconstruire, les Olympiques spéciaux ont besoin de ce financement additionnel. C'est pourquoi nous enjoignons le gouvernement à maintenir le financement supplémentaire actuel dans le cadre de son budget 2022. Félicitations à Olympiques spéciaux Canada pour tout leur travail accompli.
L'honorable député d'Orléans.
Mr. Speaker, today I want to share with this House the work that Chef Joe, a resident of Orléans and well-known owner of Tally Ottawa Coconut Lagoon, has done through his leadership and philanthropic work during the pandemic. Chef Joe has really stepped up throughout this crisis. His dedication in helping to support the most vulnerable is commendable. With the stress of opening and having to carry a payroll, Chef Joe decided to continue with his advocacy and supporting the community of Ottawa. And just this week again, he donated 2 weeks' worth of meal to the Shepherds of Good Hope. And for Joe, his business has been and is significantly impacted by the convoy. Monday was supposed to be a good day for Joe and many restaurants and stores in the downtown corridor, but it is not. I want to salute Joe and all our business owners and residents in Ottawa. We hear you, we know you are there, and we will continue to advocate for you. Merci.
The honourable member for Miramichi Grand Lake.
Mr. Speaker, the pandemic has underscored the current state of healthcare in Canada. Our healthcare institutions are overwhelmed. Massive gaps have been detected. Shortfalls in the entire system is on the brink of collapse. Intensive care units are consistently filled with patients. Surgeries and procedures have been delayed, and staff are completely exhausted. On February 4th, Canada's premiers came together and called on the Prime Minister for help, requesting an unconditional $28 billion boost to healthcare transfers. Earlier this week in Finance Committee, we uncovered $70 billion in new spending, yet none of it for federal health care transfers. Some economists were suggesting any new money should be directed at health care federal transfers. We know two things about this Liberal government. They love to spend money, but refuse to listen to Canadians. Will they listen to Canada's premiers?
I just want to remind the honourable members in the House that while they're in the House and not speaking, please to make sure that they have their masks on. And if they're not listening, I'll speak louder so they can hear me. There we go. We're fine. The honourable member for York Centre.
Mr. Speaker, 2 years ago today, we were horrified to learn of the 4-year-old Kira Kagan's death at her father's hands. Despite her mother, Dr. Jennifer Kagan's pleas for Kira's safety and providing ample evidence of a history of coercive control and abuse, the court system failed her, and a bright little girl was lost. Dr. Kagan's cry for action as a mother resonated across Canada. For victims of domestic abuse and coercive control, their struggles to protect themselves and their children is a real and terrifying challenge played out in mediations and family courts across the country. On Monday, I joined my colleagues from Dorval-Lachine-LaSalle and Oakville, North Burlington in tabling Bill C-233 to ensure training and education of judges on the warning signs and dangers of domestic violence and coercive control. I want to thank the many families who joined Dr. Kagan, not only in her pain, but in her courageous advocacy to protect our most vulnerable. Jennifer, we hear you. We hold you in your pain and will work to protect others from this harm and abuse. Kira's light shines bright and her memory is forever a blessing.
The honourable member for Labrador.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I invite my colleagues to join me in sending our condolences to the family of the late Edward Moxon Roberts. Edward was an historian, a political leader, a lawyer, and an author. He was a powerful influencer and political statesman in Newfoundland and Labrador and Canada. For 5 decades, he committed himself to outstanding advocacy, research, and legislative policies that changed and shaped communities and led the way for future opportunities. He had tremendous respect for those who served in political life, a loyal and dedicated servant himself, serving as a member of the House of Assembly, a minister of the Crown, the 11th Lieutenant Governor of Newfoundland and Labrador, and a trusted advisor to many provincial premiers. In 2009, he was recognized with the Order of Canada. I, along with my colleague from St. John's South Mount Pearl, will remember him as a loyal friend. So, Mr. Speaker, we acknowledge his dedication, how it benefited the people of his time and the generations that follow. Thank you, and thank my colleagues.
Well, member for York Simcoe.
Mr. Speaker, it's time to get York Simcoe moving. After decades, the Bradford Bypass is finally being built, ensuring that residents can get from Highway 400 to the 404 faster and safer than ever. This connecting link will ease gridlock and traffic congestion, bring economic benefit, and ensure that our growing region is ready for the future as new immigrants move into the area. The bypass has support of more than 85% of residents, including the farmers in the Holland Marsh. The soup and salad bowl of Canada, Mr. Speaker, who need safer access to their fields and a better way to ship their produce. The bypass is being built to reduce emissions, combat climate change with minimal impact on the environment and to the Lake Simcoe watershed. Downtown activists are trying to stop the bypass from being built, Mr. Speaker, but they don't know how needed the highway is. York Simcoe is glad the Ontario government is moving ahead with the bypass. Let's get it built.
The honourable member for Cloverdale, Langley City.
Mr. Speaker, as politicians, we all appreciate those who help us. Today, I'd like to recognize 3 of those individuals who played important roles on my team but are no longer with us. Gunraj Gill came to me in 2014 as a campaign volunteer, still a teenager. When asked what role he wanted to play, he responded, campaign manager. After my election, he came with me to Ottawa and loved the Hill. He tragically passed away in July 2019 at the age of 23. Lynn Whitehouse worked with the Greater Langley Chamber of Commerce for more than 30 years. Lynn was a fierce advocate for good public policy that supported small businesses in our community. After Lynn's retirement, she joined my constituency team. Lynn lost her battle to cancer this past Christmas. Charity Amuzu-May was a volunteer in my campaigns in 2015 and 2019. She played a key role with my constituency religious leaders roundtables and my youth council. Charity lost her battle to cancer this January. Thank you for allowing me this moment to recognize these 3 individuals, all of whom I miss daily.
The honourable member for Lakeland.
Mr. Speaker, Blue Quills University near St. Paul in Lakeland was a residential school in the 1930s. Now, for 50 years, it's been Canada's first Indigenous-controlled education centre, promotes pride in Indigenous heritage and reclaims traditional knowledge and practices. Blue Quills is owned and governed by Beaver Lake, Cold Lake, Frog Lake, Whitefish Lake, Heart Lake, Kahiwan, and Saddle Lake First Nations. The First Nations Caring Society is promoting Have a Heart Day. Blue Quills is encouraging students to send Valentine's Day cards to the Prime Minister, and my office will help deliver them. Their message is, Happy Valentine's Day. Please have a heart. First Nations children should not have to fight for services all other Canadians enjoy. Give First Nations children the same chance to grow up safely at home, get a good education, be healthy, and proud of their cultures. I agree with them. Beyond empathy and words, the Prime Minister must take real action to improve the well-being, the opportunities, and the futures for Indigenous children, just like for all Canadian kids.
The honourable member for Chilliwack Hope.
We now know that before the last election, the Prime Minister made a very purposeful political decision to divide Canadians based on their vaccine status, deliberately tearing at the fabric that unites Canadians in order to hold on to his own privileges and power. The Prime Minister continues to purposely stoke anger and division, hoping that Canadians will turn on each other rather than his incompetent government that continues to fail at every aspect of COVID response. To those who have felt the sting of this discrimination from your own government, we acknowledge your suffering, trauma, and loss. We hear you, we see you, and we will continue to speak up for you. It's time to change course. It's time for Canadians to reject the politics of fear and division. It's time to heal the divisions that have been intentionally sown. It's time to unite Canadians, give them back their freedoms, and end the discriminatory vaccine mandates once and for all.
L'honorable député de Madawaska-Restigouche.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Cette semaine marque la semaine canadienne de counseling scolaire et j'aimerais prendre quelques instants pour souligner les contributions importantes de la profession de conseiller et conseillère scolaire, une profession qui est en pleine progression au Canada. The school counseling profession supports the personal, social, academic, and career development and the mental health and well-being of all students in Canada in order to provide them with the opportunity to achieve school and plan for a career. Ces professionnels jouent un rôle déterminant dans le parcours scolaire des étudiants qui font face à certains défis. Ils sont à leur écoute, dis-je, et les encouragent à exprimer leurs émotions et expériences. Those counselors are committed in helping students, in working in partnership with parents and with teachers, in focusing on positive ways to enhance the students' development. Thank you to those counselors for being there for our students. Nous vous remercions d'être à l'écoute de nos jeunes. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
The honourable member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Last week, Amnesty International released a report titled Israel's Apartheid Against Palestinians, Cruel System of Domination and Crimes Against Humanity. The report, 4 years in the making, contains a number of recommendations to the government of Israel, the United Nations, and states and donors like Canada. The findings in this report are extremely serious. Both Palestinians and Israelis have the right to live in security and safety. This report has made it clear that Palestinians are experiencing neither. Canada must be a stronger advocate to ensure Israel is respecting international law and human rights. Canada can take concrete steps, including suspending arms sales to Israel and banning products from the illegal settlements until the end of the illegal occupation. I ask all my colleagues in the House to read this report. This is a conversation we must have. As parliamentarians, we have the obligation to make ourselves aware of human rights abuses and hold ourselves and our friends to account.
Le député de Beauport-Limoilou.
Monsieur le Président, je désire souligner la semaine des enseignantes et des enseignants. Être enseignant, c'est prendre les enfants là où ils sont et les mener un peu plus loin dans chacune de leurs intelligences. Et c'est fait pas seulement lorsque les enfants sont en classe. On peut sortir l'enseignante de l'école, mais certainement pas l'école de l'enseignante, je peux vous le dire. Vous avez une amie enseignante et vous voulez faire une sortie avec, assurez-vous de l'organiser en dehors de sa période de planification, en dehors de celle de suivi des apprentissages, puis surtout, évitez la fin d'étape et sa correction. De combien de livres a besoin un enseignant? Toujours un de plus. Toujours, juste un de plus. Passer devant une librairie sans prendre un livre, c'est du domaine du miracle. Vous avez besoin d'un crayon? Demandez à un enseignant, on en a toujours un à la main, puis on a des réserves. Vous voyez un enseignant acheter des articles scolaires, c'est pour sa classe. En somme, les enseignants pensent à nos enfants 12 mois sur 12. Ils sont pleinement dédiés à leur profession et méritent notre respect. Merci, enseignantes et enseignants. Merci.
The honourable member for Lethbridge.
Suffered an overwhelming amount of trauma in the last 2 years. This is due to forced isolation, countless pandemic restrictions, and moving goalposts. Countries like the UK, Denmark, and Switzerland are returning to normal life, and yet the Prime Minister of Canada won't give a signal of doing the same. It's leaving people confused, frustrated, and hopeless. Domestic violence has increased dramatically. Mental health concerns are through the roof. The use of opioids has skyrocketed. Life-saving medical treatments have been withheld. Cancers have gone undiagnosed. And people have lost their jobs because of a personal medical choice. I am calling on this government to provide compassionate leadership and abandon the harmful lockdown measures and hateful rhetoric that so often accompanies them. We need to come together as a nation and heal. We need to restore dignity, honor, and respect. The bulk of the responsibility rests on the Prime Minister's shoulders. Starting today, I'm calling on him to lead with compassion. I'm calling on him to end the vaccine mandates once and for all.
The honourable member for Oakville North Burlington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Kira Kagan was going to change the world. I wish I had met Kira. She was a bright and beautiful 4-year-old whose life was stolen by an angry father who killed himself and Kira 2 years ago today. Kira should be playing with her brother and making her mom Jennifer and stepdad Philip laugh and smile. Instead, Jennifer has had to become an advocate for changes to the court system to educate judges on domestic violence and coercive control. I can't begin to imagine the heartbreak that Jennifer faces every day, but I can support her advocacy work to ensure that no other child is killed because our judicial system doesn't recognize that domestic violence and coercive control are real and must be taken into account. I can continue to work with Jennifer to see Kira's Law, which is part of the member for Dorval-Lachine-LaSalle's Private Members Bill C-233, become a reality in Canada. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral questions. Question orale. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Up. Even countries with lower vaccination rates than Canada. Provinces are beginning to lift restrictions and getting life back to normal. Why? Because they're following the science. Canadians are ready to get their life back. But it seems like the Prime Minister wants to live in a permanent pandemic. Dr. Ham, Dr. Tam, Dr. Henry, Dr. Moore, Dr. Hinshaw, Dr. Shahab all agree it's time to shift out of the restrictions and back to normal life. So why is the Prime Minister so offside, not only with the science, but it would seem like with a growing number of his own MPs?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
On the contrary, Mr. Speaker, we intend to follow the science and are working closely with Dr. Tam and other public health officials to ensure that we get through this pandemic as best we possibly can. And that has been through vaccinations. The fact that 9 out of 10 Canadians have gotten vaccinated is one of the reasons why we're able to get through this, is why we've been able to prevent our health systems from being completely overrun. Vaccinations are the thing through this. That's why we're continuing to encourage Canadians to get vaccinated. Why, unfortunately, the Conservatives are against vaccination is, quite frankly, beyond me.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, the science and the evidence is just simply not on the Prime Minister's side. Many of the reasons previously used to keep Canadians under restrictions are vanishing before our eyes. Other countries are opening up. Provinces are opening up. As he just said, 90% of Canadians have the vaccine. The Prime Minister needs to put his ego aside. He needs to do what's right for the country. He needs to end the mandates. He needs to end the restrictions. He needs to listen to his own caucus. Will he do that?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Canadians have made it through this pandemic better than many other places because Canadians stepped up. They were there for each other. Their government had their backs. We worked closely with provincial and territorial leaders. Every step of the way, we kept focusing on vaccinations, on public health supports, on business supports. It's allowed us through, and Canadians are continuing to get vaccinated. 60,000 Canadians got vaccinated with their first dose just last week. We are continuing to make sure Canadians get vaccinated because this is how we get through this pandemic.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, we know this Prime Minister has politicized the pandemic. This summer, as BC was burning, Afghanistan was falling, and we were in the fourth wave of a pandemic, the Prime Minister called an unnecessary $600 million election to capitalize on this crisis. According to a senior Liberal MP, a decision was made to wedge, to divide, and to stigmatize. So, a country more divided than ever before. Can the Prime Minister tell Canadians why he would politicize the pandemic, why he would try to stigmatize Canadians, why would he do this to a country that is already suffering and deeply damaged by so many of his policies? Why?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let's talk about last year's election. It was an opportunity for Canadians to weigh in on the path forward for our country, on how to continue to fight this pandemic. And what we saw, unfortunately, from the Conservative Party of Canada was a refusal to step up on vaccination, a refusal to follow science. As they were talking about how we get through this pandemic, they couldn't ensure their own MPs got vaccinated. Mr. Speaker, Canadians spoke loudly and clearly in the last election that science and vaccination was the way through. They gave us in this House a mandate to move forward on that, and we did.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The Prime Minister is clearly trying to strategically and very selfishly divide and stigmatize Canadians. Mr. Speaker, we live in a beautiful country, but our country is suffering. Our country is divided. Our country is tired, and they need leadership. So again, I'm going to ask the Prime Minister. His senior Liberal MP said that there is a strategic decision made on that side to stigmatize, and these are not my words, stigmatize, divide, and wedge. This is what the Prime Minister did. Why?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, what Canadians have needed through this pandemic and what this government has provided has been responsible leadership that put the health and safety of Canadians first and foremost. That's exactly what we did. That's exactly what we talked about in the last election campaign. That's exactly what we're going to continue to do in following the science. But you talk about, the member opposite talks about Canadian suffering. Supply chains disrupted, Canadians in their homes worried of walking their streets because they continue to support blockades that are hurting businesses across the country. Will the Conservative leader stand up and condemn those blockades?
L'honorable député de Mégantic-L'Érable.
Monsieur le Président, hier, j'ai demandé au Premier ministre une question simple. L'actuel député de Louis-Hébert et ex-président du caucus libéral du Québec a clairement exprimé la motivation profonde du gouvernement libéral dans son approche face à la pandémie. Il a dit qu'à l'aube de la dernière élection, je le cite encore, d'une approche positive et rassembleuse, une décision a été prise d'adopter une approche qui divise et qui stigmatise. Le député de Marc-Aurèle-Fortin est aussi de cet avis. Est-ce que c'est le premier ministre qui a pris cette décision de diviser et de stigmatiser la population pour son propre intérêt?
Le très honorable Premier ministre.
Au contraire, Monsieur le Président, dans les dernières élections, nous avions été là pour rassembler les Canadiens autour de mandats de vaccination et on a vu les Canadiens voter en faveur d'un gouvernement qui allait mettre la science d'abord, rejeter les partis conservateurs qui ne pouvaient même pas assurer la vaccination de ses propres députés. Et maintenant, on est dans un moment difficile avec des barricades à nos frontières dans notre ville d'Ottawa et le Parti conservateur n'ose même pas condamner ces blocages, condamner l'impact sur les citoyens à travers le pays qui perdent leur job, qui perdent qui ont de la difficulté à avoir leur nourriture.
L'honorable député de Belleuil-Chambly.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. On est obligé de revenir sur les enjeux de leadership durant la crise actuelle. La critique dans les médias est extrêmement sévère et les enjeux internes du Parti libéral du Canada compromettent la capacité d'action du gouvernement. Est-ce que le premier ministre reconnaît d'une part, qu'il a besoin de mieux communiquer, peut-être avec un peu moins d'orgueil, d'adopter un ton plus conciliant sans pour autant changer l'objectif fondamental, et qu'il n'y a pas que les camionneurs qui sont inquiets de plus en plus. Surtout, est-ce qu'il reconnaît que la levée du siège est urgente et qu'il faut que ce soit fait avant la fin de semaine?
Bravo! Honorable Premier ministre.
Monsieur le Président, je reconnais absolument, et nous l'avons reconnu depuis plus d'une semaine, que ce siège est inacceptable. L'impact sur les petites entreprises, sur les manufacturiers, sur les chaînes d'approvisionnement continue et que ce soit les barricades aux frontières, que ce soit l'emprise à Ottawa, nous devons de faire tout ce qu'on peut ensemble, tous les différents paliers de gouvernement pour en mettre fin. Ce qui aiderait énormément, c'est que les partis conservateurs disent à ses supporters, à ses sympathisants, d'arrêter de bloquer notre économie et de retourner chez eux.
Le député de Belleuil-Chambly.
Monsieur le Président, il n'est pas commentateur politique, il est premier ministre. La presse internationale ridiculise le Canada. Le seul leadership du Canada, c'est de multiplier les fronts comparables à celui d'Ottawa dans d'autres villes du monde. Bravo! Canada is back. C'est l'image du Canada qui est compromise et malheureusement aussi celle du Québec. Québec a bien géré la ville et le gouvernement. Qu'est-ce qu'il va falloir au premier ministre pour se mettre à bouger, à sautiller, à faire quelque chose, à agir?
Bravo! Les honorables premiers ministres.
Quand il y a eu, il y a quelques jours, des manifestations à Québec, le gouvernement provincial, le gouvernement municipal a pu très bien gérer la situation, mais nous étions là, si nécessaire, pour envoyer plus d'aide. Mais ils l'ont bien fait. À d'autres endroits, ça a été bien fait. Il y a des défis ici à Ottawa et nous sommes ici pour appuyer les autorités locales, pour faire le travail avec la province, pour s'assurer qu'on reprenne l'ordre et le calme ici. Mais l'important, ce serait que le Parti conservateur du Canada appelle à une fin à ces barricades et arrête d'encourager leurs supporters de continuer à bloquer le Canada et l'économie.
Honorable député de Burnaby Sud.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have truckers that are stuck at the border in the Coutts border crossing in Alberta. We have truckers stuck at the Ambassador Bridge crossing in Windsor. We have an occupation in Ottawa that has hit the citizens and residents and small businesses extremely difficultly. And we know that a significant portion of funding of this convoy is from foreign US dollars. So will the Prime Minister do everything possible to stop this convoy and these protests by contacting US officials and investigating where these funds are coming from and working with them to stop it?
Honorable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we're working very hard with partners at different levels of government to make sure that we're ensuring that the flow of funds to criminal activities is interdicted. We're going to continue to do that while all the same time ensuring that there is a right for free and open legal protests. That is extremely important in this country. I will highlight, however, the irony that the member opposite brought up, which is indeed a harsh one, that when this convoy originally was all about truckers protesting, now it's truckers being protested, being prevented from doing their jobs of putting food on our tables and supporting our manufacturers.
The honourable member for Burnaby South.
On a des camionneurs à la frontière à Coutts, à la frontière à Windsor, qui à ce moment sont arrêtés, sont bloqués. Et aussi, on a un siège, une occupation à Ottawa. Les manifestations du convoi a frappé fort à travers le pays et c'est clair qu'ils sont financés en part de l'argent étranger. Est-ce que le Premier ministre va communiquer avec ses homologues aux États-Unis pour faire enquête et arrêter ces fonds?
Honorable Premier ministre.
Monsieur le Président, nous avons effectivement travaillé avec nos partenaires, incluant des partenaires internationaux, pour assurer qu'il n'y a pas qu'on surveille les fonds qui vont vers les organismes et les entreprises et les activités criminelles ici au Canada, et ce travail va continuer. Mais c'est intéressant à réfléchir au fait qu'un convoi et des barricades qui étaient dans leur début supposées être par les camionneurs sont maintenant rendus à bloquer les camionneurs dans leur travail pour livrer des emplettes et l'épicerie pour les Canadiens, de livrer de la marchandise et des produits à nos manufacturiers. Les camionneurs sont maintenant victimes de ces...
L'honorable député, the honourable member for Cumberland Colchester.
Mr. Speaker, last year an all-party parliamentary committee urged the Prime Minister to promise he wouldn't call an election. In fact, at that time, the Prime Minister himself said he had no interest in calling an election during the pandemic. Canadians were misled. Instead of prioritizing the health and safety of Canadians, he forced an election. This begs the question, why did the Prime Minister jeopardize the health of Canadians to save his own job?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, in that election, Canada had an extremely important conversation about how to move forward through this pandemic. And partially because of the clear answers...
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt the Honourable the Right Honourable Prime Minister. The Honourable Member for Cumberland-Colchester asked a question, and I'm sure he can't hear the answer with all the shouting going on around him. So I'm just going to ask everyone to tone down so that the Honourable Member for Cumberland-Colchester can hear the answer. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, in the last election, Canadians were presented with a very clear choice of moving forward with strong vaccination policies that would ensure Canadians were safe, or the Conservative proposal to not really step up on vaccination, not even ensure that all of their members were vaccinated as MPs, and not the kind of leadership on science they wanted. Canadians made a very clear choice to choose and vote for parties that supported vaccine mandates, and that's exactly what has gotten us through this pandemic to this point, with lower death rates than other countries around the world, despite all the tragedies we have faced.
Honourable Member for Cumberland-Colchester.
Mr. Speaker, sadly what we ended up with is seeds of division having been sowed and Canadians suffering. We've suffered financially, socially, morally, mentally, and physically. And according to the Misery Index, we are a very miserable nation. Shame. For almost 2 years now, Canadians have borne the yoke of loss, uncertainty, and lack of hope. The backs of Canadians are about to break. Canadians are miserable because of the Prime Minister. We want to know on what date the mandates will end.
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, once again we see the Conservatives are willing to twist the facts to their own partisan ends. The reality is vaccine mandates and the fact that Canadians stepped up to get vaccinated to almost 90% ensured that this pandemic didn't hit as hard here in Canada as elsewhere around the world. We stayed focused on following the science, on promoting public health rules, and Canadians stepped up in their communities. They stepped up for their frontline health workers. They stepped up for each other, and Canada has never been so strong and together as we are now.
L'honorable député de Charbourg-Haute-Saint-Charles.
Monsieur le Président, en novembre dernier, ce Premier ministre a dit, je cite, « La priorité absolue demeure d'assurer la sécurité des Canadiens et de suivre la science. » Aujourd'hui, on comprend qu'il n'a pas basé ses décisions sur la science. Pas un, mais deux de ses députés ont témoigné que la réponse du Premier ministre à la pandémie était de politiser pour diviser les Canadiens. Plus d'une douzaine de pays développés ont déjà commencé à supprimer les restrictions sanitaires, mais ce Premier ministre tient à contrôler la population. Le Premier ministre peut-il dire à cette Chambre à quelle date il va supprimer les restrictions fédérales de la COVID-19?
Honorable Premier ministre.
Depuis les débuts de cette pandémie, c'est sûr, nous voulons tous, les Canadiens veulent tous savoir à quelle date ça va être fini, quand est-ce qu'on va pouvoir revenir à ce qu'on faisait avant. Et à chaque étape, on a dû ajuster les mesures, on a dû amener des propositions et des programmes qui aident les Canadiens dans le moment où on est. On voit qu'avec la baisse d'Omicron, on va pouvoir changer les choses. Les choses commencent déjà à changer à travers le pays, mais nous allons être guidés par la science, par les données, par la protection pour les Canadiens à chaque étape, comme nous l'avions été depuis le début.
Le député de Charbourg-Haute-Saint-Charles.
Monsieur le Président, ce qui était clair, ce qu'on a appris hier, c'est que sous prétexte de combattre la pandémie, le Premier ministre a volontairement joué avec la santé mentale des Canadiens. Il a manipulé la population pour obtenir des votes aux dernières élections. Il a réduit au minimum les activités des parlementaires pour les empêcher de scruter les décisions de son cabinet. Il a stigmatisé tout Canadien qui avait des opinions diverses que la sienne. Sa stratégie était de diviser les Canadiens. Est-ce que le Premier ministre peut enfin admettre qu'il a utilisé la pandémie à des fins électorales pour sauver sa job?
Honorable Premier ministre.
Monsieur le Président, à chaque étape, nous avons mis la santé, la sécurité des Canadiens à l'avant-plan et c'est exactement ce que nous avons fait en suivant la science. Mais la réalité, c'est que le Parti conservateur continue à jouer des jeux partisans en appuyant ces barricades, en appuyant leurs supporters qui sont en train de bloquer nos chaînes d'approvisionnement, de bloquer la ville d'Ottawa. Ils refusent de condamner ces manifestations illégales. Ils les appuient, leur donnent du café. Monsieur le Président, quand est-ce qu'ils vont faire preuve de leadership responsable?
The Honourable Member for Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes, Brock.
Mr. Speaker, 2 Liberal MPs have said that the Prime Minister purposely politicized the pandemic. That means for crass political gain, in order to save his own job, the Prime Minister deliberately divided Canadians. We have federal mandates still in effect, stifling industries like travel and tourism, while countries around the world with the same information are finding ways to live with this virus. Speaker, on what date this month will all federal mandates be lifted?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, policy in this country is set by a government that listens to science, that follows data, that doesn't listen to people blockading our streets and blockading our borders. That is not the way to make public policy in this country. It's not the way to bring Canadians together. We're going to stay focused on keeping people alive and safe and healthy and indeed prosperous. But the fact that the Conservative Party continues to refuse to condemn the blockades that are hurting our supply chains, driving up prices, limiting our manufacturers from being able to bring in their parts across the country is a shame on them.
The Honourable Member for Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes, Rock.
Speaker, Saskatchewan and Alberta have announced an end to restrictions. Canada's chief public health advisories calling for normalcy. 2 Liberal MPs have called out their own for divisiveness. Canadians have done everything asked of them for the last 2 years. And while many other countries are offering a plan of hope, the Liberals continue to stifle industries like travel and tourism for little benefit. It seems the Prime Minister has got a little too comfortable with using the force of government rather than trusting Canadians. So, Speaker, on what day this month will all travel advisories be lifted?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, the member opposite talks about stifling industries. The reality is the support of the Conservative Party of Canada for people barricading our streets and our border crossings is harming businesses, is harming Canadians who are putting food on the table, is driving up prices, is causing uncertainty, instability, and frustration on top of people who have suffered too much because of this pandemic over the past 2 years. It is time for the Conservative Party to show responsible leadership, to condemn these blockades, and all of us to move forward together.
L'honorable député de Jonquière.
Monsieur le Président, le député libéral de Louis-Hébert a compris, lui, que la position du premier ministre sur les transferts en santé est intenable. Le PM doit impérativement augmenter le financement de la santé à long terme. C'est incontournable pour qu'on puisse devancer les chirurgies délestées, engager des infirmières, augmenter le nombre de lits pour qu'on n'ait plus jamais à confiner toute une population pour protéger le système de santé. 85% des citoyens, Monsieur le Président, exigent du premier ministre une augmentation des transferts de santé jusqu'à 35% pour couvrir les coûts. Est-ce que le premier ministre va les écouter? C'est leur argent qu'il a entre les miens, pas le sien.
Le très honorable Premier ministre.
Monsieur le Président, depuis les débuts de cette pandémie, nous avions été là pour augmenter les transferts en santé, pour augmenter les investissements en santé. En plus du 43 milliards de dollars que nous transférons aux provinces et territoires à chaque année pour leur système de santé, nous avions investi 63 milliards de dollars supplémentaires justement pendant cette pandémie pour aider à nos systèmes de santé. Et oui, nous allons continuer d'être là dans le moyen terme et dans le long terme avec des augmentations pour s'assurer que les Canadiens soient en sécurité. Le gouvernement fédéral sera là pour eux comme il l'a été depuis 2 ans.
L'honorable député de Jonquière.
Être là, Monsieur le Président, on n'est plus capable. Le premier ministre est seul à s'obstiner pour ne pas augmenter à 35% sa part du financement de la santé. Même son député de Louis-Hébert le dénonce. Ainsi, il rejoint tous les partis de l'Assemblée nationale, tous les gouvernements, ceux du Québec, des provinces et des territoires, 85% des Canadiens, 86% des Québécois. Monsieur le Président, quand on est tout seul à avoir raison, c'est souvent parce qu'on est trop entêté pour dire qu'on a tort. Ouais. Ainsi, plutôt que de s'entêter contre tout le monde, quand est-ce que le premier ministre va faire sa juste part pour la santé?
Bonne question. Très honorable Premier ministre.
Je comprends pas Monsieur le Président, ce que je peux dire de plus pour que le député en face accepte un oui comme réponse. Oui, nous allons être là pour continuer d'augmenter les transferts en santé parce que oui, nous avions été là avec 63 milliards de dollars de plus du fédéral pour nos systèmes de santé. On va continuer d'être là. On sait à quel point on a besoin de travailler ensemble pour livrer des meilleurs systèmes de santé pour nos citoyens. Le gouvernement fédéral, comme il a été là avec 8 $ sur 10 de toute l'aide pendant la pandémie, va être là pour nos systèmes de santé.
The honourable member for Regina Louvain.
Mr. Speaker, there are people across this country asking this Prime Minister for clarity, leadership, and hope. People are so frustrated with this Prime Minister that there's protests nationwide. Canadians are just asking for respect and to be listened to. With the continued uncertainty and brazen disregard for legitimate concerns around the state of our country, I ask the Prime Minister this simple question. Can he share with us what evidence he has to justify implementing an interprovincial trucking mandate?
Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, you can't end a pandemic with blockades. You can't end a pandemic by decreeing it. You can't even end it by legislation. You need to end it with science. You need to end it with public health measures. You need to end it.
I just want to point out that when the honourable member for Regina Louvain asked his question, it was dead silence. I believe he deserves the same respect when he's getting his answer. The right honourable Prime Minister, please proceed.
Mr. Speaker, you cannot stop a pandemic with blockades. You cannot end a pandemic by decree. You can't end a pandemic by legislation. You need to end a pandemic by relying on science, by public health measures, and by vaccinations. That's exactly what we have focused on through these past 2 years. And even as Canadians are tired and impatient for it to end, we are going to continue to be there for them, to support them through it, and to make sure we do everything necessary to end this pandemic.
The honourable member for Regina Louvain.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister just demonstrated why Canadians are so frustrated. He doesn't listen. I asked him to show me some evidence in science around interprovincial trucking mandates, and he totally ignored that question. So my question to him would be, maybe a redo, because he maybe will get it right the second time. How high do grocery prices have to go? How empty do grocery stores have to be for him not to implement an interprovincial trucking vaccine mandate?
The right honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, the member opposite is criticized something that we haven't even done. So there's already that issue there. But secondly, he talks about empty grocery store shelves. He talks about disruptions to supply chains. The reality is, Mr. Speaker, right now, people in Windsor are suffering and losing their jobs because they can't get auto parts across the Ambassador Bridge. People in Alberta are seeing shelves empty because they can't get deliveries across the Coots border crossing. And this Conservative Party that supports these blockades won't even stand up and say, enough is enough, it's time to go home.
The honourable member for Grand Prairie Mackenzie.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ireland, Sweden, Norway, Israel, Czech Republic, the UK, Spain, and Denmark are all removing restrictions, including vaccine mandates, even though they have a lower vaccine rate than we do here in Canada. Saskatchewan and Alberta provincial governments have also announced plans to remove their restrictions. When will the Prime Minister follow our international allies, follow the science, follow the expert advice, follow the premiers, and give Canadians a plan as to when he will remove the federal travel restrictions here in Canada?
The right honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, throughout the pandemic, different jurisdictions have handled things differently every step of the way, whether it's jurisdictions across the country that we've been there to support or different countries that have had much worse outcomes in some cases, many more restrictions in other cases. The reality is we will continue to do what is right for Canadians to keep people safe as we get through this pandemic. And yes, I understand how frustrated Canadians are, how much we need to see an end to this pandemic, but we can't do it by decree. We can only do it by continuing to trust science and getting people vaccinated.
The honourable member for Grand Prairie, Mackenzie.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that's the problem. There he goes again, refusing to answer the question. It seems he'd rather wedge, divide, and stigmatize fellow Canadians. The problem is that Canadians are better than that. They're sick and tired of his divisive games. They have done their part, and they deserve to know when Canada will follow our international allies and end our restrictions. On what date will the restrictions end?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, Canadians have done their part. They've continued to step up and get vaccinated to a higher percentage, mind you, than the Conservative caucus has. They've continued to follow public health advice. They've continued to be there for each other, to lean on each other. And now we see the Conservative Party continuing to egg on its supporters to shut down border crossings, to encourage its supporters to blockade downtown Ottawa because they're upset they lost an election. Mr. Speaker, we're going to continue to focus on supporting Canadians, on keeping people safe, and on vaccination.
The honourable member for Burnaby South.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians have done their part. They've gotten vaccinated. They've followed public health measures. And now they want a plan that'll get us past this pandemic. That plan is going to, of course, mean we've got to work with our public health officials. And it also means we have to make sure that our healthcare system is never pushed to the brink of collapse again. So will the Prime Minister put forward a plan that will chart the course for us to get past this pandemic that includes properly funding our healthcare system so it's there for our loved ones when they need it most?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we know that our healthcare systems have been stressed during these past 2 years, and that's why, as a federal government, we have continually stepped up. Every year, the federal government sends about $42–43 billion to the provinces for supporting their healthcare systems. Over the past 2 years, on top of those regular transfers, we have invested about $63 billion in healthcare, whether everything from vaccines to transfers to provinces to other measures to keep Canadians safe. And yes, we will be there to increase healthcare transfers to ensure that we have a stronger medical system into the future.
The honourable member for Burnaby South.
Les Canadiens sont vaccinés. Ils ont suivi les conseils des experts de santé publique. Et maintenant, ils ont besoin d'un plan pour comment on va sortir de la pandémie. Et ce plan va suivre les conseils de santé publique. Et ce plan doit aussi reconnaître que nos soins de santé, notre système de santé était en péril plusieurs fois pendant cette pandémie. Donc, le Premier ministre s'engagera-t-il à investir dans notre soin de santé pour s'assurer qu'il est là pour nos proches quand ils en ont besoin?
Le Premier ministre.
Oui, Monsieur le Président, nous allons être là pour investir encore plus dans nos systèmes de santé. Pendant les 2 dernières années, nous avons investi un 63 milliards de dollars supplémentaires dans nos systèmes de santé, dans les mesures de santé pour s'assurer que les Canadiens puissent passer à travers de cette pandémie. Et nous sommes en discussion avec les provinces, justement. Nous allons continuer ces discussions parce que nous savons que, oui, ça va prendre plus d'investissement pour avoir de meilleurs résultats dans notre système de santé, pour assurer plus de résilience dans nos systèmes de santé. Nous allons être là comme partenaires aux provinces et territoires.
The honourable member for Mississauga Malton.
Mr. Speaker, whether it be $10 a day for childcare or historic investments in affordable housing, our government is committed to making life more affordable for Canadian families. We know that traditionally speaking, Canadians have paid some of the highest cell phone bills in the world. Could the Prime Minister please update this House on actions being taken to make cell phone plans more affordable?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to begin by thanking the member from Mississauga-Malton for his important question. We promised Canadian families that we would reduce the cost of their cell phone bills. Today, I'm happy to announce that we have met our 25% price reduction target. In fact, we've done so 3 months ahead of schedule. This is wonderful news, but we know that there is still more work to be done. We will continue to push to improve cell coverage and to make life more affordable for all Canadians.
The honourable member for Calgary-Midnapore.
The Finance Minister continues to try to convince Canadians that all is well with the economy. But what she doesn't seem to understand is that the majority of Canadians just don't see it that way. What they do see is that their family can't afford the same groceries that they used to, and that they will try and squeak in just one more trip back and forth to pick up the kids from school before having to buy another tank of gas. Canadians are facing a cost of living crisis. When will the Finance Minister take this inflation crisis seriously and provide solutions?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
You know what's driving up the cost of living this week? The cost of groceries, the cost of parts for manufacturers? The blockades that the Conservative Party continues to support at the Coots border crossing, at the Ambassador Bridge in Windsor, and even in downtown Ottawa. Canadians have struggled for 2 years because of this pandemic in so many different ways and have stepped up and made sacrifices, and we've been there to have their backs. Why, right now, does the Conservative Party not have Canadians' backs and instead choose to support those who are blockading their neighbours and our economy?
The honourable member for New Brunswick Southwest.
Mr. Speaker, it's been 6 years and these Liberals have failed to make life better for Canadians. They've delivered the largest cost and price increases we've seen in Canada in 30 years. Plus, Ottawa's anti-Canadian energy policies have only added to the pain in the Canadian economy. The rising price of energy sets the prices for virtually everything else in the Canadian economy. Why is the Prime Minister making victims of seniors, working families, and small businesses?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, small businesses in downtown Ottawa are struggling for the past 2 weeks because Conservatives are supporting the people who are blockading them. Businesses in Windsor are suffering because goods can't get across the Ambassador Bridge because Conservative Party supporters are being encouraged to continue their blockades. In Alberta, groceries are getting more expensive because the Coots border crossing is blocked and the Conservative Party will not condemn or ask those protesters to go home.
Député de Lévis-Lobinière.
Monsieur le Président, du jamais vu au Québec l'essence ordinaire qui dépasse le 1,60 $ le litre. Toute une inflation qui aura des répercussions sur tout ce qui est transporté partout au Canada. Pendant ce temps, le premier ministre semble dépourvu par les temps qui courent. Monsieur le Président, quand le premier ministre et que le premier ministre va-t-il faire pour aider les familles à faible revenu devant cette hausse sans précédent de tout ce qu'elles mangent et qu'elles utilisent dans la vie de tous les jours?
Honorable Premier ministre.
Monsieur le Président, la crise d'inflation mondiale qu'on est en train de vivre est due à la COVID-19. Les dérangements à notre chaîne d'approvisionnement sont dus à la COVID-19 et en partie à cause des barricades qui sont appuyées par les conservateurs. Nous allons continuer de lutter contre la COVID-19 en utilisant la vaccination, en utilisant les mesures de santé publique pour s'assurer que les Canadiens puissent revenir bientôt à ce qu'ils aiment faire le plus, se rassembler, être les uns avec les autres. C'est ce que nous visons, c'est ce que nous travaillons très fort pour arriver.
Member for Kootenay, Columbia.
Mr. Speaker, gasoline is up 34%, housing is up almost 27%, sugar is up 20%, and Canadian bacon is up 17%. Inflation has increased 2 times faster than the wages of those working in my riding of Kootenay, Columbia. Families in Canada are being stretched too far. When will the Prime Minister get off his MacBook at his cottage and fix skyrocketing home prices, supply chain shortages, and the cost of living crisis?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, We recognize that we are in a global inflation crisis right now because of COVID-19, and the best way to get through that is to end this COVID-19 pandemic. Unfortunately, you can't end it with legislation. You can't end it with barricades. You need to end it with science, and that means vaccination. So if the Conservative Party is truly concerned about our supply chains, about the cost of living for Canadians, they should tell their supporters in Coutts and in Windsor to stand down those barricades and let the goods flow to Canadians.
L'honorable député de Salaberry-sur-Roi.
Monsieur le Président, depuis 8 mois, le premier ministre coupe le supplément de revenu garanti des aînés qui ont légitimement reçu de la PCU. On parle d'aînés moins nantis qui travaillent à temps partiel pour payer le loyer, l'épicerie, leurs médicaments. Après des mois, le premier ministre a réalisé que c'était inacceptable et il va les indemniser. Mais la compensation arrivera seulement en mai et il continue de couper les prestations chaque mois jusqu'en juin. Après 8 mois de sacrifice pour ces aînés, est-ce que le premier ministre convient qu'il mérite mieux que de manger de la misère jusqu'à la fin du printemps?
Très honorable Premier ministre.
Monsieur le Président, la pandémie a été très difficile sur les aînés et notre gouvernement a été là pour les aider. Nous aidons les aînés par le biais d'un paiement unique pour les personnes âgées dont les prestations ont été affectées par les soutiens de la pandémie. Et aujourd'hui, nous avons présenté le projet de loi C-12 pour exclure le revenu de prestation pandémique aux fins du calcul du SRG. Nous demandons donc à tous les partis, incluant le Bloc, de nous appuyer et à adopter rapidement ce projet de loi afin d'empêcher toute réduction future du SRG pour les aînés à faible revenu. Notre gouvernement continuera d'être présent pour les aînés.
Le député de Salaberry-sur-Roi.
Monsieur le Président, parmi les aînés victimes des coupes du supplément de revenu garanti, il y a des gens qui ne mangent pas leur faim, qui vendent leurs biens, qui perdent même le logement. Ces gens-là ne peuvent pas attendre jusqu'à la fin du printemps que la machine fédérale dégèle. Le premier ministre a prouvé avec la PCU qu'il est capable d'envoyer des chèques rapidement quand il veut. Si le premier ministre a été capable d'envoyer de la PCU à des millions de personnes dans les 10 jours suivant leur demande, il est capable d'indemniser les aînés, les moins nantis, avant la fin du printemps. Qu'est-ce qui l'empêche d'agir?
Très honorable Premier ministre.
Monsieur le Président, nous avions été là pour les Canadiens pendant 2 ans avec des appuis du jamais vu en termes d'appui pour les Canadiens, incluant pour les aînés. On les a aidés avec de l'argent supplémentaire pendant cette pandémie parce qu'on sait que ça a été très difficile. Mais effectivement, à cause de cet argent, il y a certains aînés qui sont en danger de perdre les bénéfices dont ils ont besoin cette année. C'est pour ça que nous envoyons un paiement unique rapidement et que nous proposons dans un projet de loi déposé hier de régler une fois pour toutes ce défi et nous attendons à ce que les autres partis qui se préoccupent des aînés nous appuient là-dessus.
The honourable member for Barrie Innisfil.
2 weeks ago, the Ethics Committee unanimously, including all Liberal committee members, agreed that a tender be postponed to stop the Liberals from secretly collecting the mobility data of Canadians until MPs could be sure that the privacy rights of Canadians were not being violated. But yesterday, in an unbelievable move, the entire Liberal caucus, including the same members who voted for it, voted against stopping the RFP. What a disgrace. Why would the Prime Minister vote against the committee's recommendations to make sure that the privacy of Canadians were protected?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, unlike the Conservative Party, we believe data, science, and evidence need to inform our response to COVID-19. It is crucial to inform policy and decision-making. The Public Health Agency of Canada has used de-identified data without personal identifiers to inform the government's response to the pandemic. We've also publicly provided the data to Canadians to keep them informed. We remain focused on Canadians' health and safety and continuing to uphold the privacy standards they rightfully expect.
Member for Barrie Innisfil.
Why was this vote so important yesterday, Mr. Speaker? It's because the Liberals, with their no vote, have signaled that they'll continue collecting this data without the consent of Canadians. And when you start connecting the dots, a pattern has developed by these Liberals using the distraction of a pandemic as an opportunity for massive expansion and overreach to abuse the rights and freedoms of Canadians, including their privacy rights. Would the Prime Minister at least provide a coherent reason why he thinks putting a pause on this tender was a bad idea and until we can ensure that the Canadians' privacy protection rights were protected?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we are fighting a global pandemic right now, and every step of the way we have been informed by science and data to do that. Yes, we've been protecting Canadians' privacy rights, which are always important, but we will use the tools we have to keep Canadians safe and defend their rights and values. Unfortunately, we do see the pattern of the Conservative Party that tried to scrap the long-form census, that is constantly against data and evidence, pushing back against science and data. We will be informed by the facts and by science in what we do.
The Honourable Member for Sturgeon River Parkland.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday at Public Safety Committee, I asked Toronto's Deputy Chief of Police if the Liberals' plan to spend $1 billion taxpayer dollars on a firearms buyback would have any effect on improving public safety. His answer, which has been echoed by law enforcement across this country, is that gun buybacks don't work. My question to the Prime Minister, why is he ignoring law enforcement experts? Why won't he scrap this ineffective, wasteful, and ideological scheme?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Crystal clear right now. The Conservative Party of Canada is asking us to bring back, to re-legalize assault weapons. That was something that was debated during the election campaign that they are trying hard to forget. We banned...
I want to remind... Order. I want to remind the honourable members to watch their language. Okay, I'm going to have to ask the honourable... I'm going to have to ask the honourable member to stand and apologize or withdraw.
Mr. Speaker, I will say...
I'm not asking for a long diatribe. I'm asking for an apology.
I won't give you one. I apologize for saying that he lied, but in 1977, the term...
No, it's over. That's it. No, please sit down. Apologize. That's all we need. The Right Honourable Prime Minister, please continue, and let's give the Honourable Member for Sturgeon River Parkland the opportunity to hear his answer. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, last year we banned 1,500 different models of assault-style weapons in this country. The Conservative government, the Conservative Party, is proposing to reverse that ban. They don't think it'll keep Canadians safe. Well, we had an election including on that, Mr. Speaker, and they were soundly rejected in that argument. Canadians want to see their communities safer. That's why we are for strengthening gun control, and they, unfortunately and inexplicably, are for weakening it.
The Honourable Member for Malpeque.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The interruption of trade resulting from a localized outbreak of potato wart has significantly impacted the economy of PEI and many of my constituents. From small multi-generational family farms to large producers, packers, processors and shippers, nearly every islander has been affected by this issue. I know our government has been working diligently on this file, and yesterday was a huge step forward. Can the Prime Minister update the House on how the government is progressing toward resumption of exports of the best darn potatoes in the world?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague from Malpeque for his question, his hard work, and his continued advocacy for islanders. Restoring market access for PEI fresh potatoes to the U.S. and supporting PEI farmers continues to be a top priority for our government. Thanks to the work of two of our colleagues who went to Washington and their science-based approach, the export of table stock potatoes to Puerto Rico can now resume. Wow. Mr. Speaker, we will continue to defend our farmers and to push for a science-based approach until potato exports are completely restored.
L'honorable député de Mégantic-l'Érable.
Le 13 août, le premier ministre annonce la vaccination obligatoire au niveau fédéral. Le 15 août, il déclenche des élections inutiles. Le 8 février, le chat sort du sac. Contrairement à ce qu'il dit depuis le début de la période de questions, Monsieur le Président, 2 députés de son propre caucus dénoncent la décision prise par son parti d'avoir sciemment adopté une approche qui divise et stigmatise à des fins strictement électorales. Comme le dit si bien Emmanuel Latraverse, le premier ministre a beau dire qu'il suit la science, on a tous compris que c'est bien relatif. Pourquoi le premier ministre a-t-il tourné le dos aux Canadiens? À quelle date il a pris cette décision de diviser et stigmatiser pour mieux régner?
Le très honorable premier ministre.
Dans ces dernières élections, on a présenté aux Canadiens une vision très claire de comment on allait pouvoir passer à travers cette pandémie. Ça incluait des mandats de vaccination pour tous ceux qui voulaient embarquer dans un avion ou prendre un train et pour la fonction publique fédérale. Les Canadiens ont pu se prononcer pendant ces élections sur ces enjeux-là et ont voté en grande majorité pour des députés de partis qui appuyaient ces mandats de vaccination. C'est la réalité, Monsieur le Président, et c'était très important pour ce pays de pouvoir aller de l'avant avec un mandat clair pour assurer la fin de cette pandémie par la vaccination, et c'est exactement ce qu'on a fait.
Excellent. Le député de Mégantic-l'Érable.
Le député de Louis Hébert était beaucoup plus clair. On ne peut pas mettre fin à la pandémie sans leadership. On ne peut pas mettre fin à la pandémie en divisant et stigmatisant la population. On ne peut pas mettre fin à la division en restant caché et en refusant de prendre ses responsabilités, Monsieur le Président. Il a fallu qu'un de ses propres députés, le président du caucus libéral du Québec, dénonce son plan électoral machiavélique pour qu'il sorte de sa cachette. Est-ce que le premier ministre va admettre son erreur, s'excuser aux Canadiens d'avoir pris cette fameuse décision et travailler avec les chefs de parti pour mettre fin à la division et aux manifestations?
Le très honorable premier ministre.
Les choix qu'a fait ce gouvernement pendant cette pandémie, de suivre la science, d'être là pour appuyer les petites entreprises, les aînés, les travailleurs, d'encourager la vaccination pour tout le monde, d'amener des mandats pour les voyageurs et la fonction publique fédérale, c'est toutes des choses qui ont sauvé des vies, qui sont assurées qu'on ait pu passer à travers de cette pandémie mieux que bien d'autres pays. Et les Canadiens ont continuellement été là les uns pour les autres. C'est ce qu'il va continuer de faire, mais j'encourage les conservateurs d'être là pour les Canadiens et de demander à une fin aux barricades.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. Conservatives want the protests and the barricades to end. We want people to be able to head back to work and go home knowing that they have been listened to and that they've been respected. The Prime Minister holds the key. I've asked the Prime Minister, I've sent him a letter, I've asked him if he would be willing to meet with other leaders, with myself, so that we could work constructively to end this impasse. Will he meet with us? Can we work together to find a solution? Thank you.
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the interim leader of the Conservative Party knows well that we spoke right after her election as leader to be able to work together to end this pandemic and to end these barricades and this blockage. Unfortunately, we see Conservative members continuing to encourage and support the blockades that are going on in downtown Ottawa, at the Coots border crossing, at the Windsor Bridge. When are Conservatives going to stand up for ordinary Canadians putting food on their shelves and their jobs? When are they going to stand up, condemn these barricades?
L'honorable député d'Orval-Lachine-LaSalle.
Monsieur le Président, cette semaine est la semaine du développement international. Et on tient à remercier les travailleurs, les partenaires et les bénévoles du secteur qui travaillent fort pour améliorer la vie des gens dans de nombreux pays. Cette année, j'aimerais attirer l'attention sur les femmes et les filles qui font face à des défis uniques exacerbés par la pandémie. L'honorable Premier ministre peut-il nous dire ce que fait le Canada pour soutenir les femmes et les filles à l'étranger? Merci beaucoup.
Honorable Premier ministre.
Monsieur le Président, j'aimerais remercier ma collègue de Dorval-Lachine-LaSalle pour cette question et son travail acharné. Elle a tout à fait raison. pour être à l'avant-garde de cet effort mondial. Grâce à notre politique d'aide internationale féministe, nous travaillons en étroite collaboration avec nos partenaires internationaux afin de réduire la pauvreté et l'inégalité et de relever les défis uniques auxquels sont confrontées les femmes et les filles. Monsieur le Président, nous allons continuer nos efforts à cet égard.
The honourable member for Burnaby South.
The Ambassador Bridge crossing in Windsor is one of the busiest in all of Canada, and it's vital to the people of Windsor and the surrounding region. Windsor and the surrounding region rely heavily on travel back and forth between the border. Residents, small businesses, manufacturing sectors all require it. Right now, because of the convoy protests, truckers are being blocked, and it's severely impacting Windsor and the surrounding region. What is the Prime Minister doing to end that shut down and open up the border for the truckers to get back home and deliver the goods to Windsor and the surrounding region?
You're right, Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Ambassador Bridge is critical for trade, and this blockade poses significant risks to our supply chains. Illegally blocked trade routes means empty shelves, higher prices, and layoffs in the trucking, manufacturing, and retail sectors. It is ironic, Mr. Speaker, that a protest and a blockade that was ostensibly by truckers is now blockading truckers themselves. Mr. Speaker, Canadians have the right to peaceful protest, but they don't have the right to illegally block our roads or harass residents. So I want to once again thank the 90% of truckers who've been vaccinated and working hard every day to keep our economy moving.
The member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like, through you, to extend to the Prime Minister my thoughts and hopes that he and his children are recovering well. My question is that this week marks 2 years since we had any financial update from the Trans Mountain Corporation, one that we lamentably own after incredibly foolishly buying the climate-killing Trans Mountain Pipeline. It now appears to be 5 times above its original cost estimate. Will the Prime Minister agree that we need a full, transparent review of the alleged costs and benefits before a single additional penny is wasted on this project?
Right, Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians know that we need to make sure we are decarbonizing our economy and reaching net zero by 2050. But in the coming years, we're going to continue to rely on oil and gas as we move forward in our economies. That's why making sure we get the best possible price for our oil sources so we can invest in the transformation of our economy is important. That's why the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which allows us to get product to countries other than the United States, is important for our economy, but it is also a way to make sure we're investing in the transformation towards a greener economy.
I'm afraid that's all the time we have for question period today. C'est tout le temps que nous avons aujourd'hui. It being 3:20 p.m., pursuant to order made on Thursday, November 25th, 2021, the House will now proceed to the taking of the deferred recorded division on the motion of Mr. Steinley relating to the business of supply. Call in the members. Convoquez les députés. Can I have order? I just want to compliment our technical team. The last couple of days, you can tell there was a little bit of choppiness. They found what the problem was, wanted to make sure everything was secure. I just want to compliment them on the work they did. So this is for our techies in the background, making sure that everything runs smoothly. The question is the following one. Mr. Steinley, seconded by Ms. Block, moved, whereas on October 21st, 1880, the Government of Canada entered into a contract with the Canadian Pacific Railway Syndicate for, may I dispense? Thank you. Okay, we're going to need. La période de 10 minutes pour les députés votant par voie électronique a été activée et la Chambre procédera maintenant au vote des députés qui participent en personne. All those in favor of the motion will please rise.
Ms. Bergen. Monsieur Paulus. Mr. Nader. Mr. Scheer. Mr. Barlow. Mr. Chong. Mr. Moore. Mr. Brassard. Monsieur Berthold. Mr. Fast. Mr. Albus. Mr. Hoback. Ms. Dancho. Mr. Macaulay Edmonton West. Mr. Schmale. Mr. Vidal. Mr. Stewart. Mr. Tucker. Mr. Jennis. Mr. Baldinelli. Mr. Lake. Mr. Lloyd. Mr. Lawrence. Mr. Duncan, Stormont Dundas, South Glengarry. Mrs. Gray. Mr. Kimmich. Mr. Calkins. Ms. Lanceman. Mr. Upal. Mrs. Kuzi. Mr. Malillo. Mr. Aitchison. Mr. Lobb. Mr. Zimmer. Mr. Perkins. Mr. Reid. Mr. Small. Mr. Caputo. Ms. Ferrari. Monsieur Gould. Mr. Steinley. Ms. Rude. Mr. Ellis. Mrs. Goodridge. Mrs. Kramp-Nyman. Mr. Halan. Mr. Bazan. Mr. Richards. Mr. Dreesen. Mrs. Block. Mr. Seaback. Mr. Williamson. Mr. McGuire. Mr. Abu Tayyif. Mr. Arnold. Mr. Deltel. Mr. Godin. Mr. Reyes. Mr. Cooper. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kitchen. Mrs. Stubbs. Mr. Leipert. Mr. Shields. Mrs. Thomas. Mr. Viersen. Mr. Waugh. Mr. Weber. Mr. Barrett. Mr. Davidson. Monsieur Lehoux. Mr. Bragdon. Mr. Dalton. Mr. Dowdle. Mr. Epp. Mr. Cram. Mr. Couric. Mr. Lewis Essex. Monsieur d'Entremont. Mr. Mazer. Mr. McLean. Mr. Morantz. Mr. Morrison. Mr. Patzer. Mr. Redicott. Mr. Shipley. Mr. Soroka. Mr. Van Popta. Mr. Ruff. Mr. Brock. Mr. Muse. Mrs. Roberts. Mr. Tolmie. Mr. Williams. Mr. Poiliev. Mr. Julian.